Welcome to Intelligent Artifice, the podcast that helps you become a 10x performance marketer. Intelligent Artifice explores the cutting edge of the intersection of AI, creatives, and performance marketing. Every week, we deconstruct the ad systems behind high performing advertisers using our in house semantic analysis system, BruteForce.ai, or we sit down with top operators redefining how advertising gets done in a generative AI world. Whether you're scaling user acquisition, leading a creative team, or building a creative engine with AI, this podcast is your unfair advantage. Intelligent Artifice is hosted by me, Shamant Rao, the founder and CEO of the boutique growth marketing agency Rocketship HQ. You can find out more about us at rocketshiphq.com. Our services are ideal for advertisers spending over $50,000 a month on paid social. Check out the podcast website, intelligentartifice.net, or our newsletter, intelligentartifice.kit.com. Our guest today is Félix Boudreau, VP of Growth and Marketing at Pok Pok, the award-winning digital toy for kids. He has a number of years of experience scaling companies with massive budgets, and he's a proven growth leader who has driven major international expansion and industry partnerships. I'm very excited to welcome Félix Boudreau to Intelligent Artifice. Félix, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Shamant. I'm really excited to talk more about AI in apps.
I'm excited to have you, Félix, because I've followed your work for a very, very long time. And I also admire you because you're one of the few people who walks the walk, because there are a lot of gurus out in the world and you actually have done the work. And that is something I truly admire about what you've done. And you're not just talked creative, but you've actually unlocked a very significant scale with creative wins. And you've also been kind enough to share, which I'm hoping you'll continue to do on this interview. Yeah, for all of those reasons, I'm excited to have you on the show. Again, let's start with the gurus. We and I have all seen the posts that talk about end-to-end automation using AI. Press a button and out comes the winner that's going to generate like multiple millions of dollars. What's your experience in terms of end-to-end, push a button, get a miracle kind of solution?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that because I see those posts all the time on LinkedIn or X, people who claim that they create like 500,000 videos every single day or every single week. But my question is always like, how are they doing? Because they often put any performance aspect to it, any screenshots of how it's killing their campaign and stuff like that. Because I don't disagree. You can create so much with AI so quickly. But I think in most of cases, the real bottleneck is actually the testing. Testing ads is very expensive. So the problem is not creating 500 or 1,000 assets, is creating assets that you really believe are going to work and you have really strong faith that are going to work. So for us, we have experimented a bit with creating an end-to-end AI funnel with agents, like doing research and putting it into script and then putting it into video. But most of the time, it is very time consuming to create these agentic kind of flow, but also they require so much tweaks for a result that it oftentimes underwhelming. And in my experience, hasn't worked great. So that's the big thing. Is it creating assets that are strong enough to perform and scale? And where I've seen the most impact when it comes to AI and especially creative production is to empower a team of individual contributor to produce a lot more and add a lot of bandwidth. So be it allowing research to be done more efficiently by uploading thousands of reviews and like distilling what is the most important, or looking at competition and creating reports, or the most I think we've gotten out of it is when it comes to asset generation to create static assets very quickly. But it is not necessarily a magical solution where you can go on vacation for 2 weeks and your campaigns are running and being updated automatically with awesome ads that are generated from scratch.
I 100% agree, and that's been my experience as well. That anything we've tried just requires so much manual quality checks, intervention. I'm also just reminded of this quote, which I actually sent to my newsletter a while ago, but it's basically this is by I think Peter Drucker, but there's no such waste of time as doing really efficiently that which shouldn't be done at all. And I'm like, every time I read one of these posts, I think of the quote. I'm like, yeah.
I think if creative testing was not so expensive, it might be different. Because if there was no cost to testing, I think it would be another like discussion. But the fact that it's so expensive to get really results that you can be be very confident, and it puts
Yeah.
the impetus in more creating creative that are very strong and are going to connect. And if you're able to do that with AI, great. But we found that in many cases, having more human input is actually probably going to save us money.
Yeah, 100%. And in my experience, also, the part that is somewhat underrated is coming up with better ideas. I think there's just a lot of emphasis on do more. I think there's not nearly as much emphasis on do better, which I think is what you're also hinting at and intuiting as well.
Totally. I think you have to have a lot of intent into your creative process because, again, the challenge is not to produce 500 ads, is to produce ads that you understand why they work and you can double down on. So like it's having great hypothesis and being able to ideate and iterate. Also in a way, I think what is underrated is in a way that you can communicate to a team, because if it's all unstructured and you don't find ways to discuss about what is working, what is not working, it's just AI doing everything, you're going to end up just throwing spaghetti at the wall. And then it's hard to go back from there and take a step back. Because if you're just throwing spaghetti at a wall for a year and there's nothing working, then you have a lot of work to restructure everything, go back to the beginning, make sense of all of that.
100%. And having that human angle to it, right? Just having that intent is so critical. And that is actually something I'm hoping to learn from you in this call, because because it's also my experience. One of the things we are wanting to do better is, as our creative output has scaled, just do a better job at synthesizing some of the learnings, some of what we are learning. And that's, like I said, something I'm hoping to learn. So with that in mind, talk us through your weekly creative cycle. What does your creative testing cycle look like? What are the different steps in your creative testing cycle?
For us, we have a bit of an unorthodox approach when it comes to the creative part of our cycle. So what we do typically in a week is from Thursday to Sunday, we will be testing new creative. So it's a relatively short window. And how it works is that we have, for each ad set, we have a hypothesis or a concept behind and 3 to 10 iterations in each of those ad sets. So it's very structured in the sense that for each of them, we have a clear idea of what we want to accomplish with it. And then basically we run it for those 4 days. If they're not performing well, even after 2 days, we might turn some of them off to save money. And if they're performing well, we might leave them running for longer just to confirm that what we're seeing is truly real. And we might even add more scale when it comes to budget. So we have this testing unit that is more or less during the weekend. So on Monday, what happens is that we have our creative meeting, which is truly like the anchor of our week. So our creative UA manager is going to sift through all that tasting data to see what happened with the creative, look at our main metrics, and put all of that in a Figma board. So it's very visually clear what happened, ranking all the ad sets from the best performing to the worst performing. And then from there, digging into the iteration. Okay, this concept did pretty well, but what part of the iteration worked well? Is it because, I don't know, the hook was this, or because the image in the back was this, or this color worked well? Often devils is in the detail with those type of iterations. So really digging deep. And the idea here is that our whole team is present. So we have our UA manager, our creative UA manager, we have our designers. I'm there. We often have guest spots to get different point of view on it. So we brainstorm and we decide for each ad set, can we push this further? Have we iterated enough? Or sometimes we're at a point where like, okay, we've tried 50 different copies with that creative. We've tried like every possible human variation. So sometimes we decide to kill a concept or stop there, or we decide that we can do more with it. Or also if the performance is just terrible and there's no silver lining to it, and we can't even see a crumb of something interesting in like the click-through rate or something, then we kill it. After that, we basically have our asset creation process. So like from that Monday to Thursday, our designers create the assets that are going to be tested for the rest of the week. So this is typically what our weekly process looks like.
Well, yeah, and that sounds very comprehensive, and there's just so much I want to dig in. So I know you spoke about you generating hypotheses. How do you do that, or suggest people do that at scale? if someone's really scaling creative, and again, I don't know if you're able to share how many concepts you guys test, but I don't know if you can speak to that.
Totally. So what we're doing right now is that we're doing 7 to 10 ad sets, and each of those have their own concept of a hypothesis behind, and each of them will contain somewhere between 3 and 10 creatives. Most of them are iterative in nature. We're still trying to scale that process to get from 10 to maybe 20 different ad sets, which should give us like about 150 to 200 ads. And the idea here is just really to go with intent. To when you create an ad set, just like, what do you think is going to work with it? Is it because you're addressing a point that you've discovered in a user interview? Is it something you've seen competition doing? Is it a trend that you've seen on TikTok that is really taking off? What is it that you think is going to work? Because otherwise it's just really hard to discuss if it's just like, basically we just create ads however so that we think is working, and then when you try to talk about it, it's just very hard to put words into it. So it's just having an intent about it, because I think anyway, when you create an ad set or like a concept, you have an idea of why it's going to work. So the goal here is just to put words behind it and share it with the team. I'm doing that. I really think this is going to connect because we're using this word that I've seen everywhere on TikTok that really describe the problem our users having. That is a way you can verbalize it, for instance.
Understood. So if I understand correctly, really being able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing, that's the most important thing that you suggest. Let's just say you have 7 to 10 ad sets, and presumably within, let's just say, hey, the hypothesis is, here's a trend I see blowing up on TikTok. Here's an ad set. Each ad set corresponds to one hypothesis. This is the TikTok trend we're testing. So you have maybe 10 versions of portraying that TikTok trend, if you will, 10 variations, if you will. And then I'm also trying to understand what level of granularity do you get into, right? Because you could say, my hypothesis is, here's a TikTok trend and I have a yellow banner on it. Or here's a TikTok trend, I have a spinning visual hook, and that can quickly add up. And again, I'm just asking this for our own process, because that's one of the things we struggle with, where once we take the hypothesis way too granular, we start to go insane. So
yeah, that's a very real problem, because it's also, that's where the more art than science sometimes when you deal with creative, and sometimes you can't make hard rules. Like, what is the threshold of a concept? You could put it on paper, but also it's something that's going to be flexible. So sometimes it's just, I would say, how we think about concept is something that is meaningfully different from what we've done before. And then meaningfully different is open to interpretation. But I would say, for your example, changing a background would not be a new concept. That would be very much an iteration. Just to give you an example, maybe that is more concrete, of something we've done recently. So we're playing a lot with ads in Plane, because Pok Pok is an app, basically an educational learning game for kids that are 2 to 8. And what is differentiating from other kids' app is that it's really designed to keep kids calm and not overstimulated. And for that reason, we found a lot of success with parents using it in planes, because it's a very anxiety-ridden situation where kids can get very overstimulated. We found success with ads in that context. So we've done a lot of stuff in Plane. And someone came with a new concept, I think this week. They're like, those safety pamphlet in flights that tell you what to do in case of an emergency. Let's just take that aesthetic and create an ad with it. So this is a new concept, because although we've done a lot of UGC content in Plane, like just text with a picture taken inside a plane, we haven't done that. So that feels very different. And we treat that as a new concept, and then we'll have one that is like the basic one, and then we'll iterate maybe 7 of them with copy or visual and launch it and see what happens.
Okay, so these 7 versions of the pamphlet go into a single ad set, and there is just one hypothesis, which is, look, we want to build on the experience of a parent in a plane.
Correct. Yeah, and that particular hypothesis is taking the safety pamphlet aesthetic and visual format, is it going to connect? Because it's something that you will only see in a plane. And then we even further structure it, because then the issue is okay, you have this creative, then there's a couple things that can work with that hypothesis, and we mostly break it off in two things. One of it is copy, because sometimes copy can make a huge difference. And then there's the visual aspect of it, how you treat that copy and how you express that concept visually. So we often like to approach it as in two steps, because like any experiment, if you test multiple variable at once, then you don't know what worked. For that concept, the first way we'll do it is probably the same visual with maybe 7 different copy. Then we can see, okay, that copy really seemed to connect more. And then for the next test, we're probably going to play more on the visual aspect. Okay, so we'll do a fake person holding pamphlet in a plane. We'll do one where it's just a pamphlet taking the whole ad and kind of dig more into the visual one. The visual part of things.
Understood. So if I understand correctly, let's just say week 1, when somebody on your team comes up with this idea, you're saying, okay, we got the pamphlet. Let's test that as a hypothesis with 7 different copy ideas. Let's see which one works well. Or if none of these work, it's just no. And assuming you see some signal, week 2, you say, great, this copy is working well. Let's take this copy. Let's make different visuals on now.
Yeah, exactly. And we have those on Figma. We follow like these little things and it becomes almost a maze that, okay, that was the original format. This is the iteration that worked. Then we iterated with these things. So it's like a madman rambling board, but it really helps to see, okay, we started there, because sometimes it takes us 4 or 5 iteration before we really hit a big winning creative. Like it rarely happens that we put it out there and it's from the get-go a massive success. So like you have to be able to dig a bit in, look at what the signals are sending back, like what are metrics telling you? Are people clicking on it? Okay, people are clicking on it, but they're not converting. Why is that? Is it because we don't explain the value props well enough? So then iterate. And then sometimes 4 or 5 steps in, then it really works. But again, structure is important to be able to go deep.
100%. And just understanding what the key components are. Again, in theory, there could be an infinite number of components, but is your intuition in terms of which one?
You have to simplify it sometimes, because you're 100% true. There's like an infinite amount of variation. But what is important when you're working in a team is also being able to verbalize it. So sometimes I think dumbing things down is actually a good way to do it, because otherwise, if you're testing like thousands of different like minute details, once you're like, for one, you're losing time, like you're less chance of it working if it's really minute differences. So you have to go bigger, and also you have to make sense of it. Otherwise, if every time you do something, you don't have an idea where it's working, and we're like, we don't have a clue it's working. So then how do you iterate? But for sure, a lot of it we don't understand, and sometimes we probably don't have the right pick of why it's working, and that's just part of it.
And again, I have so many follow-ups, if only for our own learning. If I understand, you're coming up with these hypotheses and you're making multiple versions and sequentially iterating on these. This may be a simple, somewhat stupid question, right? But the first time you're testing hypothesis, why make 7 to 10 versions of the hypothesis? Why not just do one and see, does it even have legs, or does this completely bomb, in which case we should move on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something we've been like struggling with in terms of, do we just use one or do we do a couple? And right now we're doing a couple. It might change in the future as we get more data, but our reasoning behind that is that there is a chance that if you go with one concept, with one kind of like visual interpretation, that it doesn't work. But it's not actually because the concept is bad. It might be just because the hook copy was just not quite right. We see that happening again and again. Like just a couple words difference can mean that a concept takes off or dies. So our thinking for the first kind of like version of it is to cover more ground, to make sure that at least it has more opportunity to work than if it's just one or nothing. So we'll often start with copy, as depending on the concept, it can vary, but often we'll just try to cover a couple ways to express that concept to make sure it didn't fail because we didn't express it in the right way. But of course, you have to stop somewhere. Like we won't do 30 to make sure we cover every possible scenario, because then we might not have confident result when it comes to which one works. So this is a compromise we've found, like 3 to 10, depending on what it is, to cover a bit of ground, but not go crazy with it.
Yeah. And once you see it has some legs, you can perhaps build on that. That makes sense. I know you talked about sequentially building on some of the learnings of something that has some early performance. And you also said, look, you are running 7 to 10 ad sets at any point of time. And I imagine that is constrained by budget. Out of the 7 to 10 shots on goal that you have every week, how do you think about how many of those shots on goal have to be building on something that's already been winning versus here's a completely new idea, which is a pamphlet maybe? How do you think about that?
Again, this is sometimes more art than science. It's like it depends on a lot of factors. We have like a rule that we try to do 70-30, meaning 70 more digging on concept that have worked and 30% more new concept. The idea behind that is often statistically, like with our process, we found more success with iterating on past winners, but that might change as we mature. Maybe we'll stop working as much. And also often they're cheaper to produce because we already have a basis for it, or we have like footage that we already own. So again, from a budget standpoint, it makes sense. But I think it really depends on where you are in your process. We might hit a point where, okay, all the concept that had been working for us are really tired and we're not squeezing any juice out of them. So maybe in that point, we might say, hey, let's shift that percentage to 50-50 or even 60-40 with new concept until we start getting new winners that feel more fresh, and then dig on those. So yeah, it really depends where you are. And like anything with UA, you have to experiment and be flexible and see where you are at any points and question your methods.
For sure. Again, just getting back to the fact that you're playing with limited budgets. Why not have a setup where, you said each ad set has one hypothesis, and let's just say pamphlet, you make 7 ads, goes into one ad set. Why not solve the budget problem by just saying, hey, I have one hypothesis, pamphlet, I have this other hypothesis, which is basically kids in a school setting. Let's just put both those in a single ad set. Let's just see what the algorithm surfaces. Why not do something like that?
We used to do that, but the result, it depends how you set it up. But if you tell, let's say Meta, to put the money where it's the most efficient, what you're going to get is that perhaps it's all going to go to the same single concept, right? Like it's going to disregard the other one because it's not just as efficient, but it's not going to answer exactly if it's failing because it might not just get any budget. If it gets budget, what we can get is sometimes we miss the mark with how we executed the concept, meaning that actually there might be the cost per click is really good, but we just didn't express some aspect of it. And I guess if we bundle things, we do save money, but we don't have as granular information about the concept. So it is a trade-off that, again, before when we had less budget, we would do things like that. We would bundle things because we're like, the belief is the winner's going to come up on top. And it often does. But what you're losing is like more granular information about actually that concept is not bad. You're just not executing it well. And maybe 2-3 iteration down the road, it could become your biggest winner. So that is why we're proceeding in that way right now.
Understood. Yeah. And I think what you briefly mentioned makes sense that an earlier stage when you had lower budget had to do that because you didn't have as much spend.
Totally. Like that point is where we need something to spend on. So it's more about finding a winner, and you're so happy when you find a winner that you don't really care about the rest of the structure. But I think, again, in an endeavor where you're testing 200 ads, let's say per week, if you don't have more structure, I think downside becomes really big of not having any insights when you test something. Because I think the cool part of this process is that if an ad set fails, it's still a learning. It's okay, maybe people don't care that much about that pain point. So like at least you've learned that. And that's is something that is really cool that you might not make that mistake again. Whereas if everything's bundled, I think it becomes a bit blurry.
For sure. Yeah. And I hear you, right? If you're testing a lot, you have to have some structure. So if I might ask, what was the inflection point where you were like, we are relatively unstructured? And I recollect I'd spoken with you at a point when you had relatively less structure, and I might actually have audited the account at one of those times. We can cut that out if need be. Right? And what was the inflection point in going from, okay, here's us putting everything in a single ad set, not a lot of structure, let's see what the algorithm surfaces to, right now, let's really start to segment a little bit more, be more intelligent, even if it costs us a little more in terms of dollars.
Yeah, I can point out two things that led us there. One of them, I want to put credit where credit is due. We started to work with Jessica Bisego, which is a consultant based in Berlin, and she brought a lot of the process in the company. So like that is one way that was like a big inflection point where we understood better the structuring and the importance of it. But the other point is more actually from an attribution standpoint, because before everything, all our campaigns were scanned because we're a kids app. We can't leverage IDFA. So we are a scan. And even with scan, we had more limited attribution settings. And that meant for once that everything was delayed, right? Like we had to wait multiple days, which made testing even more expensive because for trials, we had to wait 3 days. So you can't stop any creative before you get trials back. So that meant that our like creative testing framework was a lot more expensive and we couldn't break things down in really small ad sets. And what changed that is actually when we started to go with a web to app approach, which meant that the attribution settings were a bit different and we got information a lot faster, which kind of made our budget work better. And also we start to get some wins. So like we try to keep creative testing as a percentage of our global spend. And as we were able to scale our other campaigns, we got more budget. So that kind of snowballed into us having more budget for creative testing and being able to break things down into smaller increments. But the biggest thing was probably honestly web to app, because the delay with scan made things a lot more complicated and expensive.
Understood. Yeah, first of all, Jessica's great. I've interacted with her and had her on an earlier incarnation of this podcast. So she's really smart. So I'm glad.
Yeah, she's great.
You guys got to work together. And if I might double click on some of what you said, right? So when you said, hey, some of the processes that she brought in were really helpful. Is there anything that sticks out as something very specific that was like, here's why we need to go from testing everything en masse to being more granular? What, if anything, is there anything that comes to mind?
She brought a lot of things, but like one of them that allowed everything to jive better was that before with scan, our testing process was a lot longer. So we didn't have that weekly cycle that we have now that brought a lot of velocity. So changing that allowed us to have that, and it brought on so many good things, because testing also on a weekly basis, it allows you to remember, like all the team remembers why we created ads and what was the idea. But before it was so long that we would bring ads that we created a month ago and we'd just look at it and we're like, why did we do that? Like, people are like, oh, I think someone saw it there. I don't know. It was not as dynamic as a process, and that brought a lot of stuff. And also, I think the rest came with things doing better because we were able to test more. And then it brought need for more structure, because when we were testing 10 ads a week or something like that, structure didn't feel as necessary because everyone knew what it was and it didn't feel so complicated. But as we scaled, I think we saw it reaching 50 or 70 ads, where the importance of structure, like things like naming convention, became like really, really important. Because before we just all knew what it was, but when you're testing that amount of creative and also minute iteration, it's all the boring stuff, but it's all like good practice when it comes to knowledge management, almost like having a granular naming convention, putting information in a place that makes sense, even like displaying ads in a way that everyone understand. Like she brought that Figma board brainstorming way to work, and having everything visually laid out really brought a lot of good things when it comes to ideating, to like knowing what we're talking about, because you can even put the videos there so people can click on it and then they're like, oh yeah, like that was pretty cool what we did, like how can we do better? So that was really transformational.
I can imagine. And you talked about the process inflection point that may not always coincide with the outcome inflection point. So what, if any, was the outcome inflection point?
So I think it took a couple weeks of more rigorous testing in that way before we got a big creative win. And that was really encouraging because, like you said, like it doesn't happen instantaneously. You don't change your process and the next day oh, we've done it. It might happen, great, but the reality is it can take several weeks and even several months sometimes to hit a really big creative winner. And it's very hard to predict when it's going to happen. The only thing you can control is the amount of stuff you test and how good your ideas are. So it took a couple weeks, but then what we found, what was really encouraging is once we hit a really big winner, as we iterated on it, we hit a lot of other winners. So those learnings really compounded really quickly. And that kind of taught us to be like, okay, that is also why we have to be structured, because we can push creative so much farther by having a structured approach and being like, okay, so this copy we use in a plane, right? Let's use it in a car. Let's use it in a train. Right. Okay, like a train at night, does that work? So like really being structured and intentional about it really helped squeeze more juice of winning creative. And I believe that almost all big winning creative can be pushed a lot, like more so than you think. And that's something that I didn't understand well before. I was like, it's a winning creative, like how much can you better it? But often the answer is, oh, you can push it a lot farther, and then that means you can spend, instead of 500,000 on that ad, which would be really good, you can spend a lot more by refreshing it and keeping it vibrant. So that is very cost efficient when you think about it.
Yeah, and that is also something I've changed my mind a lot about. Even like a few months ago, I think part of me was like, why would you want to build on a winning creative? I want to come up with new ideas. It was almost like a badge of honor to come up with new ideas. But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but I thought the same, but when you see it happen, you're like, oh, because it's not for, I thought, oh, you can get maybe a 10% incremental like lift in performance on that ad. But what we saw was not like 10%. It was like, it works twice as good by literally, and I'm saying literally, changing a couple words on it.
Yeah.
And that's something I was like, if someone had told me that, I would be like, yeah, I'm not sure I believe you. It must be something else. But like, I've seen it happen. So then, now it's hard not to become crazy, because then you're like, have we used the exact right combination of words to make it pop? And that can become a bit maddening, but it really opened my eyes to the fact that people see an ad, there's a lot going on there, but sometimes they cue in to something very particular that connects with them. And it can be a very minute difference that makes it work or not.
Yeah. Is there an example that comes to mind of a minute difference that had a disproportionate impact?
Yeah, totally. So one thing, when I say that sometimes it takes a couple iterations to make it work and you have to be open-minded, it was one of those examples. So we had this UGC video of a mom going on a car ride with their kid and saying, oh, I'm using Pok Pok because it really helps my kid like calm down and be happy in the back and not go into a tantrum, and I can focus on the road. This type of creative. So we created it, and initially it was very lukewarm reaction. Like I think I was almost like, oh, let's kill it. I don't think it's gonna work. But my team was like, no, I think there's something there. So it was good that I listened to them. So that creative wasn't all that great. But then for a next iteration, we're like, let's do that thing where you pretend it's a tweet, right? Like you put a fake tweet border around it with an image, an avatar of the person. And then we played with the copy on it. Like what was the caption to it, like what did the person write on the tweet. And we tested 10 of them, and one of them I think is, I've never seen my toddler play so calmly, or something like that. And it just took off like crazy compared to the other ones. And some of them, it was almost that there was like 2 more words in it. So I was like, and then I remember we even retested that one that was almost the same thing, but it never worked. And that one worked in every setting, and not only in the US, like in other countries. So my rational mind at first was like, it can't be just that difference that blew it up. But after seeing it blow up again and again and again, and seeing all these minute ones that are slightly different never blow up, okay, this is why we really have to be mindful of minute differences and also have a structured process so we can dig deeper and get the most out of those.
Yeah, 100%. And it's hard to say, again, it's hard to explain why of the minute difference one. And I imagine that's also the reason why you want to do multiple variations, multiple iterations, so you can surface these ones.
Yeah, totally. But again, the downside to that is you have to know when to stop, because sometimes you just can't afford to test everything for everything, like to have 150 iteration for one concept, because you have to move on at some point. Like you have, even for the team, so the team doesn't get discouraged, because if you just pursue everything like endlessly, it becomes really discouraging. discouraging. So sometimes you have just to call it and be like, listen, we're 15
Yeah.
iteration deep. We believed in that
Yeah.
concept, but it's just not connecting. And let's move on to the next thing.
And through this process of building this machine, if you will, were there moments when you were like, did we just make this whole Frankenstein monster that's probably completely useless? Did you question this entire structure you were putting together?
Yeah, I don't think we really have. I don't think we've created a monster ever because we
Okay.
were always mindful of like
Okay.
someone
Okay.
would pull it up. Is guys, like we can't, like you have to, people see your ad as one. Like I'm gonna rephrase that. So people see your ad just as the final product, right? They don't know it's the 15
Yeah.
iteration. So you have to put
Yeah.
yourself in that mindset. Like they won't see it as, okay, I understand. Like they went with that and then they shift after 3 seconds because that other part is
Right.
working. So you have to look at it in a more holistic manner. And if it just looks like a mess, you can test it, but it's
Yeah.
probably not going to work. Like you have to look at it from the eyes of a
Right.
viewer
Right.
as well and take a step back sometimes when you're seeing you're creating a
Sure.
monster. And also
Sure.
there's the brand aspect. If it
Sure.
just looks extremely sloppy or just too weird, do you want that associated with your brand? Maybe not.
Sure. And you talked about organizing these ideas just to make sense of a lot of this at scale, right? And what level of granularity does that typically entail? So, what I mean is you could be like, here's ad number 102 underscore visual XYZ underscore visual hook underscore copy version underscore 15 seconds.
Yeah.
You could make that, again, bit of a monster. So what level of granularity do you look at in terms of just the naming conventions or the number of variables that you typically want to be testing?
In that case, I would say we have created a monster with our current naming convention. It is extremely granular, but I don't hate it at the moment. We'll see if it backfires at some point, but it is extremely information heavy. What we do though is that we do create a unique code for all the ad, each single iteration. So that is the same code, whether we use the ad, I don't know, on a campaign in Meta in the US or in Australia, it's going to be the same code. And even if we use it on another app platform, it is going to be the same code. And I like that because then you could do cross like app platform analysis. Oh, is this ad working like across the board, or is it only working on TikTok, or is it only working on Meta, on Reels, like in Australia? So having that is helpful, but otherwise we are very granular. We're going to put the length of it. We're going to put the number of iteration of a concept it is. I think we're putting the UGC name. If it's like this particular UGC, we're going to put it because then again, when you parse through the data, you can make interesting findings that are really hard to do when you're looking at it week to week. You can be like, oh, Erica is always getting a crazy click-through rate. There's something in her performance. So maybe we work more with Erica and not work more with Mark. That's why I think it's important to be granular, because at scale, you're going to have so much information that I think you can make interesting findings with them. But we might backtrack at some point and be like, this is way too heavy of a structure. But right now, I'm going more into the monster direction than like the simplification.
It's certainly something we struggle with. I can't say we have a solution. That's certainly something we're working with. And with the tools, I'm again very curious. You did say Figma for the visual impact. How do the metrics live in Sheets or Excel?
Yeah, they live mostly in Google Sheets right now, I would say, when it comes to the metrics.
Okay. And is there a way to cross-reference the Google Sheets with something more visual like the Figma? Or does somebody have to say, this is ad number 712, let's check this out in Figma?
So how we do it is that we try to link everything. So you should be able to see the ad when you look at, let's say, the data on the spreadsheet. But also what we do is on Figma, we try not to push too much information, but we do put the basic metrics on the Figma board. So like we'll take from the spreadsheet and put it next to it. So when we try to find new ideas, or like often also it's interesting going back a couple of weeks and being like, oh, like that, I didn't remember that worked pretty well. So we do put the most important data there so we can link creative and data. And I think that is another big finding. It's important to see both at once sometimes. And I think that's what you're leading to, is like seeing the actual creative and seeing the data. So that's how we do it for now. We have tried Motion or some creative analytics platform. We were on it. It was pretty good, but we decided not to renew. But we're still experimenting with all of that. Is there a better way to, I guess, gain insight quickly and sift through all that information?
For sure. I did try Motion a while ago. I found it wasn't the best at scale as you scale with complexity, but I don't know if they've changed since then.
Yeah, we were thinking about trying it again. There was some good aspects to it, but there's something about Figma what we like. It's just that it's really a board and you can structure things however you like. Because often we change how we like to see things really quickly. Because when you go from 50 to 75 ads, you get new issues, I find. And same thing when you go to 75 to 100. And these tools are really practical, but they're more static. So sometimes they're not moving fast enough, or for how your team like to work. So maybe that's the issue.
For sure. And is that not a somewhat manual process to update Figma and your spreadsheet and stuff?
It is very manual at the moment. So we're looking into ways to perhaps automate some of it or just make it more efficient. But again, it's hard to automate things when your process are evolving really fast, because by the time you automate something, it's okay, we're going to have to change that again. But it is top of mind in the sense that, are we wasting time with that? Could we automate some of it so we can spend more time ideating or doing more important stuff?
Yeah, I think with Python, it should be relatively easy to automate. That's one thing we do, and I can brief you offline if that's helpful.
Yeah, we're looking at that very moment to see if we can use Python or some scripting to make it easy.
Yeah, Python's changed things a lot for us in terms of moving things physically, which was driving people crazy. Yeah, excellent. I know, Felix, we're close to time, and we are at question 2 in our script. Only 8 more questions to go. But thank you for the segues and follow-ups. I think this has been incredible in just diving in deep into our process, into your process. This is incredible. I do want to be respectful of your time. And again, for people who are listening, I'm not joking when I said we had a script, we started at question 2, but I think the tangents and the segues, have been so instructive, and this is perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap up. But before we do that, could you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Where I like to post stuff lately is on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Félix Boudreau. Otherwise, download Pok Pok. It's a great app for kids 228, so you should look at that. Otherwise, I don't know when it's going to be published, but I'll be at the Revenue Cat App Conference in October in New York, October 14, I believe. If you're around, go there. I think it's going to be a really great one.
Wonderful. We'll link to all of that in the show notes. And for now, this is a good place for us to wrap up. Thank you so much, Felix.
Thank you, Shaman. That was a really interesting discussion.
That was great. Thank you for going so off script. Thank you for being open to going off script. This is great.
I know I would like a conversation like that because it goes really deep into it. I wonder if it's going to bore people, but I know if I had listened to that 6 months to a year ago, I think I would have liked that. Really digging into it.
And part of this is the very selfish thing of our own workflow and working with it, right? Because we're at a point with a number of engagements where it's starting to go crazy. So this has been...
Yeah, and it's more about, I find, because it's always have to evolve your process, and it's more about making the right decision, but also making a decision that you can explain and that makes sense. But anyways, it's good to experiment, and process don't stay the same for very long. I think that's the biggest mistake you can make. Just be stuck in your creative test. Because I know one thing I want to ask you is, I think in creative testing, I saw a post that you did that you do a 2-tiered system where you do downloads and then a more in-depth funnel event for the second.
Or both rounds are to the in-depth funnel event, but we try to do 2 rounds.
Okay.
The first round, we don't make 7 or 8 variations, but I think this, what you're saying, might make us change that point of view.
It's always, the thing is, if I do one, I'll be like, what if we just...
Yeah, exactly.
But also you have a lot of clients, so also that is, if you do that with everyone, it's times that hundreds and hundreds of creative.
Very interesting task.
Perfect. Thanks, Shaman. Have a great day.
You too, bye.